The words left Donovan Xavier's mouth before he had fully processed what he was saying. But there was no taking them back now, as the entire village square fell silent around him. "She's my wife," he said firmly, his calloused hand reaching back to find hers, their fingers intertwining in a way that had become as natural as breathing over the past months. And behind him, Grusha heard those words for the very first time, her green-skinned fingers tightening around his as her heart thundered in her chest with such force she thought it might break free entirely. The villagers of Millbrook stared at them with expressions ranging from shock to outright disgust, and Grusha could see the blacksmith's wife actually take a step backward, as if the very sight of an orc woman in a worn cotton dress, holding hands with one of their own might somehow contaminate her. But Donovan did not let go of her hand, did not step away from her, and those 3 simple words he had spoken changed everything between them in ways neither of them had fully anticipated when they woke that morning. It had begun 6 months earlier when Grusha had stumbled onto Donovan's farmstead more dead than alive, her left side torn open by what looked like claws from some massive beast, blood soaking through the leather and furs she wore, her green skin pale from blood loss. She had collapsed in his wheat field just as the sun was setting, and Donovan had been checking his irrigation channels when he heard the heavy thud of her body hitting the earth. His first instinct had been to run for his hunting rifle, because orcs meant danger in these parts, meant raids and stolen livestock and burned homes. But when he had approached cautiously and seen the extent of her injuries, seen the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps, something in him had shifted. He had dragged her into his barn, which had taken considerable effort because even injured and weakened, she was solid muscle and stood at least 6 feet tall, taller than him by a few inches. He had laid her on a bed of clean straw and brought every medical supply he owned, which was not much, just bandages and whiskey for cleaning wounds and some herbs his late mother had taught him to use. Grusha had drifted in and out of consciousness while he worked, and when her eyes had opened to find a human man stitching her wounds closed, she had tried to fight him despite her weakness. "Be still," Donovan had said, not unkindly, pressing a hand to her shoulder. "I'm trying to help you." "Why?" She had rasped, her voice thick with pain and suspicion. Her tusks, small and curved, were stained with her own blood from where she had bitten her lip. "Because you'll die if I don't," he had answered simply, threading his needle again. "And I've seen enough death. That had been true enough." Donovan had served 5 years in the border wars before returning to his family farm, and the things he had seen in those years had left scars that went deeper than skin. He had killed orcs in battle, had watched his fellow soldiers die at their hands, but he had also seen orc children starving in the ruins of their villages, and orc elders executed for resisting human expansion into their territories. War had not made him hate orcs, it had made him hate war itself, and when he looked at this injured woman bleeding in his barn, he saw only someone who needed help. Grusha had not trusted him at all those first few days. She had watched him with suspicious dark eyes every time he brought her water or food, had flinched when he changed her bandages, had refused to speak except to answer direct questions with single words. But Donovan had been patient, had continued to care for her wounds and bring her meals and make sure she had blankets when the nights grew cold. He had not asked her what had attacked her, or why she was alone, or where her clan was, because he sensed that those questions would only make her withdraw further. It had been nearly 2 weeks before she spoke to him in full sentences, and when she did it was to ask why he had not turned her over to the authorities. "They pay bounties for orcs this close to human settlements," she said, her voice stronger now, her wounds healing with the remarkable speed of her kind. You could have made good coin. Donovan had been forking fresh hay into the barn at the time, and he paused to look at her properly. She was sitting up now, her back against the barn wall, her dark hair falling in thick waves around her shoulders. The bruising around her wounds had faded from black to purple to yellow-green, and her natural green skin tone had returned to healthy vibrancy. She was beautiful in a way that caught him off guard, all sharp angles and fierce eyes and barely contained strength. "I didn't help you for coin," he said finally. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do." "Humans do not usually think helping orcs is the right thing," Grusha had replied, and there was such bitterness in her voice that it made Donovan's chest ache. "Maybe not," he acknowledged, "but I'm not most humans." Something had shifted between them after that conversation. Grusha had begun to relax around him, had started asking him questions about his farm and his life, had even offered to help with chores once she was strong enough to walk without pain. Donovan had protested at first, told her she needed to rest and heal, but she had insisted that she could not simply lie around being useless when he was providing her shelter and food. So Grusha had begun helping around the farm, and Donovan discovered that she was incredibly strong and surprisingly knowledgeable about growing things. She could carry water buckets that would have required 2 trips for him in a single journey, could pull weeds faster than he could identify plant diseases he had never learned to recognize. When he asked her how she knew so much about farming, she had explained that her clan had maintained gardens and crop fields before they were driven from their lands by human settlers 3 years prior. "We were not raiders," she said quietly one evening as they worked together to repair a fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. "We grew our own food, raised our own animals, traded peacefully with the few humans who would deal with us. But more settlers came and they wanted our land, and when we refused to leave they burned our fields and killed our livestock and drove us into the mountains." "I'm sorry," Donovan had said, and meant it. Grusha had looked at him with something like surprise. "You did not do it." "No, but my kind did. And I'm still sorry it happened to you." They had worked in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, and when their hands had accidentally touched while reaching for the same fence post, neither of them had pulled away as quickly as they might have before. The weeks had turned into months, and Grusha had remained at the farm. Donovan told himself it was because she was still healing, still regaining her strength, but the truth was he had grown accustomed to her presence and found himself reluctant to see her go. She had moved from the barn into the small guest room in his farmhouse, had begun cooking meals with him in the evenings, had started sitting with him on the porch as the sun set to watch the sky turn colors neither of them had words to properly describe. It was during one of those evening porch sessions that Donovan had realized he was falling in love with her. Grusha had been telling him a story from her childhood about stealing honey from wild bees and getting stung so badly her face had swollen up like a melon. And she had been laughing at the memory, her eyes crinkling at the corners and her tusks flashing in the fading light. And Donovan had thought with sudden clarity that he wanted to hear her laugh like that every day for the rest of his life. The realization had terrified him because he knew what it would mean, knew the complications and dangers that would come from a human man loving an orc woman. But he could not unfeel what he felt, could not unknow what he knew, and from that moment forward every interaction between them had been colored by his awareness of his own heart. Grusha seemed to sense that something had changed though Donovan had not spoken of his feelings. She had become more careful around him, more aware of the space between their bodies, more hesitant to meet his eyes. But she had also stayed, had made no move to leave the farm, and Donovan had taken that as a sign that perhaps his feelings were not entirely one-sided. The situation had come to a head 3 days before the village confrontation, when a group of human travelers had stopped at Donovan's farm asking for water for their horses. Grusha had been working in the garden and had immediately retreated into the house when she saw them approaching, but one of the travelers had spotted her anyway. "You've got an orc on your property," the man had said to Donovan, his hand moving to the sword at his belt. "Want help getting rid of it? She's not in it, and I don't need help with anything," Donovan had replied, his voice cold as winter stone. "She's welcome here." The travelers had exchanged glances that Donovan could not quite read. "You know it's illegal to harbor orcs in this province without declaring them to the magistrate, right?" Another one had said. "You could lose your farm over this." Donovan had not known that, actually, and the information had hit him like a fist to the gut. But he had kept his expression neutral and said, "Thanks for the warning. Now take your water and move along." After the travelers had left, Grusha had emerged from the house looking stricken. "I did not know I was putting you in danger," she said. "I should leave. I should have left months ago." "You're not going anywhere," Donovan had said firmly. "This is your home now if you want it to be. Donovan, you could lose everything because of me." "I would lose more if you left." Grusha had stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "What are you saying?" Donovan had taken a breath, had stepped closer to her, had reached out to take her hand in his. "I'm saying that I love you, Grusha. I know it's complicated and I know it's probably crazy, but I love you and I want you to stay." Her hand had trembled in his. "I am an orc. You are human. This is not possible. It's only impossible if we decide it is. Your people will never accept this. My people would never accept this. Then we'll make our own people. You and me." Grusha had pulled her hand away, had stepped back, had wrapped her arms around herself like she was holding herself together through sheer will. "I cannot ask you to give up everything for me. You're not asking. I'm offering. Donovan, I know what I want, Grusha. The question is, what do you want?" She had not answered him that night, had instead retreated to her room and stayed there until morning. But the next day she had come to him while he was feeding the chickens and had said, very quietly, "I want to stay. I want to stay with you, but I am afraid." "Of what?" "Of what they will do to you because of me. Of what they will do to both of us." Donovan had set down the bag of chicken feed and had cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her sharp cheekbones. "Let me worry about that. Just tell me if you feel the same way I do." Grusha's eyes had filled with tears. "I do, I have for months, but I tried not to because I knew it would only bring pain." "Love isn't always easy," Donovan had said, "but it's always worth it." She had kissed him then, or he had kissed her. Neither of them was quite sure who moved first, but their lips had met, and it had been everything Donovan had imagined and more. Grusha had tasted like the honey tea she drank in the mornings, and her tusks had pressed gently against his upper lip in a way that was strange and wonderful. And when they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "So, what do we do now?" Grusha had asked. "Now we figure out how to make this work," Donovan had said. That figuring out had led them to the village of Millbrook 3 days later, because Donovan had needed to purchase supplies, and had decided that hiding Grusha away was not a sustainable long-term solution. If they were going to build a life together, they needed to do it openly, needed to face whatever reactions came head-on. Grusha had been reluctant, had argued that it was too dangerous, but Donovan had convinced her that they could not live in fear forever. The journey to Millbrook had taken most of the morning, with Grusha riding beside Donovan on the wagon seat, her posture rigid with tension. She had worn her best dress, a simple cotton thing in deep blue that Donovan had bought for her from a traveling merchant, and she had braided her dark hair back from her face. She looked beautiful and terrified in equal measure, and Donovan had kept one hand on her knee the entire ride, silently promising her that he would protect her no matter what happened. The village had noticed them immediately, of course. It was impossible not to notice an orc woman riding openly through the main street, and by the time Donovan had pulled the wagon to a stop in the village square, a crowd had already begun to gather. The whispers had started instantly, spreading like wildfire through the assembled villagers, and Donovan had felt Grusha stiffen beside him. "It's going to be fine," he had murmured to her. "You cannot know that," she had whispered back, and then the questions had started. Who was she? What was she doing here? Why had Donovan brought an orc to their village? Was he mad? Did he have a death wish? Donovan had helped Grusha down from the wagon with deliberate gentleness, his hand at her elbow, and when he turned to face the crowd he had seen the fear and hatred in many of their faces. These were people he had known his entire life, people who had watched him grow up, people who had attended his parents' funerals and welcomed him home from the war. But they were looking at him now like he was a stranger, or worse, a traitor. Who is this? The village elder, a severe woman named Margaret Thorne, had demanded. "Donovan Xavier, explain yourself." And that was when Donovan had spoken the words that changed everything, had reached back for Grusha's hand and had said with absolute conviction, "She's my wife." The silence that followed had been deafening. Grusha's fingers had tightened around his, her breath catching audibly, and Donovan had known that he had just made a commitment he had not fully discussed with her beforehand. But it was the truth in his heart, even if it was not yet the truth in law, and he needed these people to understand that Grusha was not some temporary curiosity but a permanent part of his life. "Your wife," Margaret had repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious," Donovan had said. "Grusha is my wife and she is under my protection. She is an orc, she is a person, and she is my wife." The crowd had erupted into chaos at that point, with everyone trying to speak at once. Some were shouting that it was an abomination. Others were demanding that Grusha be removed from the village immediately. Still others were calling for Donovan to be arrested for harboring an illegal resident. But through it all Donovan had held Grusha's hand and had stood his ground, his jaw set with determination. Finally, Margaret had raised her hand for silence, and slowly the crowd had quieted. "Donovan," she said, her voice slightly softer now, almost pitying. "I understand that you have been alone since your parents passed, and that loneliness can make a man desperate. But this is madness. Orcs and humans do not marry. It is not done." "It is done now," Donovan had replied. "We love each other and we are committed to building a life together. That is all that matters." "The law matters," Margaret had countered. "And the law states that any orc residing in human territory must be registered with the magistrate and must wear an identification collar at all times. If she is truly your wife, then you must follow the law." Donovan had felt Grusha flinch at the word collar, had felt the way her whole body had gone tense, and rage had flooded through him. "She is not an animal to be collared," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She is a free woman and my wife." "Then she cannot legally remain in this village," Margaret had said. "Those are your choices, Donovan. Register her and collar her, or remove her from human lands." "There is a third choice," Donovan had said. "We leave and you lose the business I bring to this village every month. We go somewhere that will accept us as we are." That had given Margaret pause, because Donovan's farm was one of the larger ones in the region and his business was not insignificant. But before she could respond, another voice had cut through the tension. "I will vouch for them." Everyone had turned to see who had spoken, and Donovan had been shocked to see Father David stepping forward from the crowd. Father David was the village priest, a kind-faced man in his 60s who had known Donovan since he was a child. "Father," Margaret had said, clearly as surprised as everyone else. "I said I will vouch for them," Father David had repeated, moving to stand beside Donovan and Grusha. "Donovan Xavier is a good man, a godly man, and if he says this woman is his wife, then I believe him. Love is a sacred thing, and it does not recognize the boundaries we humans try to impose upon it." "But she is an orc," someone from the crowd had protested. "And we are all children of the Creator," Father David had said firmly. "The scriptures tell us to love our neighbors, not to hate those who are different from us. If Donovan and Grusha wish to build a life together, then it is not our place to stand in their way." The crowd had murmured at that, uncertain now, and Donovan had felt a surge of gratitude toward the old priest. Margaret had looked displeased but had seemed to recognize that she was losing ground. "Very well," she had said finally. "If Father David vouches for them, then they may remain. But Donovan, understand that this will not be easy. There will be those who refuse to do business with you, who will shun you for this choice. Are you truly prepared for that?" "Yes," Donovan had said without hesitation. "I am," Margaret had nodded slowly. "Then I wish you luck, you will need it." The crowd had gradually dispersed after that, though many had cast dark looks at Grusha as they went. Donovan had finally allowed himself to breathe, had turned to Grusha to make sure she was all right, and had found her staring at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You called me your wife," she said softly once they were alone except for Father David. "I know," Donovan said. "I should have asked you first. I am sorry. I just needed them to understand that you are not temporary, that you are my future." Grusha had shaken her head slowly. "I am not angry. I am just surprised, and grateful, and terrified." "We'll figure it out together," Donovan had promised. Father David had cleared his throat gently. "If you truly wish to be married, I would be happy to perform the ceremony. It will not be legally recognized by the crown, but it will be recognized by the church, and that is worth something." Donovan had looked at Grusha, had raised his eyebrows in question. "What do you think?" Grusha had taken a shaky breath. "I think that if we are going to do this, we should do it properly. Yes, I want to marry you, Donovan Xavier." "Then let us make it official," Father David had said with a warm smile. The ceremony had taken place 2 days later in the small village church, with only Father David and 2 witnesses present, as required by church law. The witnesses had been the church groundskeeper, a deaf old man who did not care one way or another about orc-human relations, and the groundskeeper's daughter, a young woman named Alice who had always been kind to Donovan and who seemed genuinely happy for them. Grusha had worn the same blue dress she had worn to the village, and Donovan had worn his best suit, the one he had not touched since his father's funeral. Father David had led them through the traditional vows, though he had modified some of the language to be more inclusive of their unique situation. When it came time to exchange rings, Donovan had produced 2 simple iron bands that he had forged himself in his workshop, and Grusha's hands had shaken as he slipped one onto her finger. "Do you, Grusha, take Donovan Xavier to be your husband, to love and honor him for all the days of your life?" Father David had asked. "I do," Grusha had said, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her green cheeks. "And do you, Donovan Xavier, take Grusha to be your wife, to love and honor her for all the days of your life?" "I do," Donovan had said, his own eyes stinging with emotion. "Then by the power vested in me by the church, I pronounce you husband and wife. Donovan, you may kiss your bride." The kiss had been gentle and sweet, and when they pulled apart, Father David had been beaming at them. "May the Creator bless your union and grant you many years of happiness together," he said. Alice had hugged them both, congratulating them warmly, and even the old groundskeeper had offered a gap-toothed smile and a thumbs up. It had been small and simple, and not legally binding in the eyes of the Crown. But to Donovan, it had been perfect because Grusha was now his wife in every way that mattered. They had returned to the farm as husband and wife, and that night they had consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and overwhelmed. Grusha had been nervous at first, had admitted that she had never been with anyone before, and Donovan had taken his time, had been gentle and patient, had made sure that her first time was everything it should be. Afterward they had lain tangled together in his bed, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder, and Donovan had felt more complete than he had ever felt in his entire life. "I love you," Grusha had whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Donovan had whispered back, but their happiness was not destined to remain unchallenged for long. 2 weeks after the wedding, a messenger had arrived at the farm with an official summons from the provincial magistrate. Donovan had been ordered to appear before the magistrate in the capital city of Thornhaven to address the matter of his illegal orc resident. "They are going to try to take you from me," Donovan had said to Grusha after reading the summons. "Then we run," Grusha had said immediately. "We take what we can carry and we disappear into the wilderness, and live as fugitives for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulders. Better that than being separated." Donovan had pulled her close, had kissed the top of her head. "I am not going to let them separate us. But I am also not going to run. We are going to go to Thornhaven and we are going to fight this legally." "How? You said yourself the law is against us." "The law is unclear, actually. Father David has been researching it for me. There are old laws on the books from before the wars that allowed for interspecies marriages under certain conditions. They have not been used in decades, but they have also not been officially repealed. We might have a case." Grusha had looked skeptical, but had agreed to try. And so 3 days later they had set out for Thornhaven, with Father David accompanying them to serve as their legal advocate. The journey had taken 4 days by wagon, and they had camped along the roadside each night, Grusha always sleeping pressed close to Donovan, as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Thornhaven was the largest city Grusha had ever seen, a sprawling metropolis of stone buildings and cobbled streets, and thousands upon thousands of people. She had drawn stares everywhere they went, and more than once they had heard people hiss insults or make warding signs as if she were some kind of demon. Donovan had kept his arm around her the entire time, silently daring anyone to say something directly to his face. The magistrate's office had been an imposing building in the government district, all high ceilings and marble columns and intimidating portraits of stern-faced officials from ages past. They had been made to wait in an anteroom for over an hour before finally being called into the magistrate's chambers. Magistrate Harold Pemberton had been a thin, severe-looking man with graying hair and eyes like chips of ice. He had looked at Grusha with open distaste as she entered with Donovan and Father David, and Donovan had immediately disliked him. "Donovan Xavier," Pemberton had said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You stand accused of harboring an unregistered orc in violation of Provincial Code 734. How do you plead?" "Not guilty," Donovan had said firmly. "She is not an unregistered orc. She is my wife." Pemberton had raised an eyebrow. "Your wife? Show me the marriage certificate." Father David had stepped forward and placed the certificate on Pemberton's desk. The magistrate had examined it with a frown, then had set it aside dismissively. "This is a church document, not a legal one. It has no standing in a court of law. Actually, it does, Father David had said calmly. Under Provincial Code 218, any marriage performed by a licensed religious official is considered legally binding unless specifically contested on grounds of coercion, fraud, or incapacity. None of those conditions apply here. Pemberton had looked annoyed. Code 218 applies to marriages between humans, not between humans and orcs. Code 218 does not specify species, Father David had countered. It simply states that any marriage between two consenting adults is legally binding. Unless you can show me specific legal language that forbids interspecies marriage, then this certificate is valid. The magistrate had fallen silent, his jaw working as if he was chewing on something bitter. Finally, he had said, "Even if the marriage is technically legal, which I am not conceding, the orc must still be registered and collared as per Provincial Code 734. My wife's name is Grusha," Donovan had said coldly, "and she will not be wearing a collar. Then she will be deported beyond the borders of human territory, and you will be fined for non-compliance with the law. You cannot deport her. She is married to a human citizen. That grants her residency rights. There is no provision in the law for orc spouses of human citizens because such unions are not supposed to occur. But they do occur," Father David had said quietly. "And the law must adapt to recognize them. You cannot punish people for loving each other, Magistrate Pemberton. That is not justice." Pemberton had glared at all of them for a long moment, then had leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "This is highly irregular. I need time to consult with my legal advisors and to review the relevant statutes. I am postponing this hearing for 1 week. You are all to return here at this same time next week for my decision. In the meantime, the orc Grusha is to remain in your custody, Mr. Xavier, but she is not to leave the city limits. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly clear," Donovan had said. They had been dismissed after that, and had found lodging at a small inn on the outskirts of the city that was willing to accept them despite Grusha's presence. The innkeeper had been a gruff older woman who had explained that she had lost her son in the orc wars and had every reason to hate orcs, but that she hated unjust laws even more. "Nobody should be forced to wear a collar," the innkeeper had said. "Not even an orc. You can stay here as long as you need." That week of waiting had been one of the longest of Donovan's life. He and Grusha had spent their days exploring the city as much as they dared, always staying together, always aware of the hostile stares that followed them. But they had also found unexpected pockets of kindness. A baker who had given them free pastries. A book merchant who had engaged Grusha in a long conversation about agricultural techniques. A group of children who had been fascinated by her tusks and had asked if they could touch them, much to their mother's horror. At night, they had lain in their small rented room and held each other, talking about what they would do if the magistrate's decision went against them. Grusha had again suggested running, disappearing into the wilderness, but Donovan had been reluctant to give up on the legal fight. He believed, perhaps naively, that the system could be made to work for them if they were persistent enough. On the 7th day, they had returned to the magistrate's office with Father David, their hearts pounding with anxiety. Pemberton had kept them waiting again, though not as long this time, and when they were finally called into his chambers, he had looked deeply unhappy. "I have consulted with my legal advisors and reviewed all relevant statutes," he had said without preamble. "And I have concluded that while your marriage is highly unusual and not in keeping with the spirit of our laws, it is technically legal under the letter of those same laws. Father David is correct that there is no specific prohibition against interspecies marriage, and therefore I have no grounds to invalidate your union. Donovan had felt a surge of relief, so intense it had made him dizzy, but Pemberton had held up a hand before he could speak. "However," the magistrate continued, "I am required by law to ensure that all orcs residing in human territory are properly documented. Therefore, while I will not require Grusha to wear a collar, I am requiring that she be officially registered as a legal resident and that she carry identification papers at all times. Failure to produce these papers when requested by authorities will result in immediate detention and deportation." "Is that understood?" "Yes," Donovan had said quickly. "We understand. Thank you, Magistrate Pemberton." Pemberton had waved away the thanks irritably. "Do not thank me. I am merely applying the law as it is written. If it were up to me personally, this entire situation would be handled very differently. But it is not up to me. Now get out of my office before I change my mind about something." They had not needed to be told twice. The registration process had taken another 2 days of bureaucratic paperwork and fees. But at the end of it, Grusha had been issued official identification papers that declared her a legal resident of the province and the lawful wife of Donovan Xavier. She had stared at those papers with tears in her eyes, had traced her name written in formal script with one green finger, had whispered that she had never thought she would have legal recognition as anything other than a monster. "You were never a monster," Donovan had told her fiercely. "You are a woman, and you are my wife, and now everyone has to recognize that." They had returned to the farm triumphant, and life had settled into a new rhythm. Grusha had thrown herself into the farm work with renewed energy, and together they had managed to increase their crop yield significantly. Word had spread about their legal marriage, and while some villagers still refused to deal with them, others had become curious enough to give them a chance. The baker started buying wheat from them again. The miller agreed to grind their grain. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to be accepted, but acceptance came with its own challenges. 5 months after their return from Thornhaven, a group of orc raiders had attacked a neighboring farm, killing the farmer and stealing livestock. Immediately suspicion had fallen on Grusha, despite the fact that she had been with Donovan the entire night of the raid and could not possibly have been involved. A mob had formed in the village and had marched to their farm, torches and pitchforks in hand, demanding that Grusha be turned over to them for questioning. Donovan had met them at the property line with his hunting rifle in hand and murder in his eyes. "Get off my land," he had said, his voice like iron. "We just want to ask her some questions," one of the villagers had said, though the weapons they carried suggested they wanted to do more than talk. "She had nothing to do with the raid, and you know it. You are just looking for someone to blame because you are scared." "Of course we are scared. Orcs are attacking us. One group of orcs attacked one farm. That does not make my wife guilty of anything." "She is one of them. She is one of us," Donovan had corrected coldly. "She is a member of this community, a legal resident and my wife. And if you take one step onto my property, I will shoot you for trespassing." The mob had hesitated, uncertain, and then Father David had appeared, having somehow learned of the situation and rushed over to help. "This is not the way," the priest had said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Punishing an innocent woman will not bring back the dead or prevent future attacks. It will only make us into the very monsters we claim to be fighting against. But we have to do something," someone had shouted. "Then do something useful. Organize patrols, strengthen our defenses, help the widows and children of the slain farmer, but do not become murderers yourselves." The mob had gradually dispersed after that, though not without plenty of grumbling and dark looks. Donovan had finally lowered his rifle, his hands shaking with adrenaline, and had found Grusha standing in the doorway of the farmhouse looking pale and frightened. "They will never fully accept me, will they?" she had asked quietly. "Some will, some will not. But I accept you, and that is what matters. I do not want you to have to point guns at your neighbors because of me. They stopped being my neighbors the moment they showed up here with torches. You are my family now, Grusha. You are my wife, and I will protect you with my life if I have to." She had come to him then, had wrapped her strong arms around him, and they had held each other while Father David tactfully looked away. The seasons had turned after that, summer fading into autumn and then into winter. Grusha had experienced her first snowfall at the farm, had been delighted and amazed by the white flakes falling from the sky, had insisted on going outside to catch them on her tongue like a child. Donovan had watched her with a heart so full of love it felt like it might burst, and he had thought about how lucky he was to have found her, to have chosen to help her that day instead of turning her away. Winter had been hard in other ways. The crops were harvested, and the fields lay fallow, and there was less work to occupy their time. But it had also been a season of intimacy, of long nights spent by the fire talking about everything and nothing, of mornings waking up tangled together under piles of blankets, of learning each other's bodies and hearts in ways that went beyond the physical. Grusha had also begun teaching Donovan some of the Orc language, and he had taught her to read and write in common tongue with greater fluency. They had learned each other's songs, each other's stories, each other's dreams. Grusha had confessed that she had always wanted children, but had never thought it would be possible for her. And Donovan had said that he wanted children too, that he wanted to fill the farmhouse with the sound of little voices and laughter. "I do not know if orcs and humans can even have children together," Grusha had said uncertainly. "I do not know either, but I would like to try if you would." They had tried, with enthusiasm and dedication, and 2 months into the new year Grusha had begun experiencing morning sickness. The village healer, an old woman named Maud who had always been kind to them, had confirmed that Grusha was pregnant, and the news had sent both Donovan and Grusha into a state of shocked joy. "A baby," Grusha had kept repeating, her hand on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to be parents," Donovan had said, grinning so wide his face hurt. But the pregnancy had not been easy. Grusha had suffered from severe morning sickness for the first 3 months, had been exhausted all the time, had experienced strange cravings for foods Donovan had never heard of, and had to travel to the city to find. And there had been the constant worry that something might go wrong, that their child might not survive, that the mixing of orc and human might create complications neither of them could predict. Maud had done her best to reassure them, but she had also admitted that she had no experience with mixed blood pregnancies and was learning as she went. She had consulted old medical texts and had even written to a colleague in the capital who specialized in unusual cases, but ultimately they were in uncharted territory. The pregnancy had progressed despite their fears. Grusha's belly had grown round and swollen, and Donovan had spent hours with his hand pressed against it, feeling their child move and kick. They had argued good-naturedly about names, with Grusha wanting to use orc naming traditions and Donovan wanting to use human ones. Eventually, they had compromised and decided to choose based on the child's sex when it was born. The village's reaction to the pregnancy had been mixed. Some people had been genuinely happy for them, had offered gifts and advice and support. Others had been horrified, had predicted that the child would be a monster or an abomination. And a few had suggested, not very quietly, that the child should be destroyed after birth to prevent the contamination of the human bloodline. Donovan had been ready to commit violence over those comments, but Grusha had stopped him, had said that anger would not change closed minds and would only make things worse for their child. So Donovan had swallowed his rage and focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, building a crib and gathering supplies, and doing everything he could to make sure Grusha and the child would be safe and comfortable. The labor had begun on a warm spring evening when the apple trees were in full bloom. Grusha's water had broken while they were eating dinner, and she had looked at Donovan with wide, frightened eyes and had said, "It is time." Donovan had immediately ridden to the village to fetch Maud, his heart pounding with fear and excitement. The healer had come quickly, her bag of supplies in hand, and had set up in the bedroom while Donovan paced outside like a caged animal. The labor had lasted through the night and into the next day, with Grusha's screams echoing through the farmhouse and tearing at Donovan's heart. He had wanted to be with her, to hold her hand and support her, but Maud had insisted that he wait outside, that she needed room to work. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, a baby's cry had pierced the air, and Donovan had nearly broken down the door getting into the bedroom. Grusha had been lying in bed, exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, and in her arms was a tiny, wriggling baby. "It is a girl," Grusha had said, her voice hoarse from screaming. "We have a daughter." Donovan had approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and had looked down at his daughter for the first time. She was perfect. Small and wrinkled and perfect, with a dusting of dark hair on her head and tiny fists waving in the air. Her skin was a pale olive green, lighter than Grusha's but darker than Donovan's, and when she yawned, he could see the tiniest buds of tusks beginning to form in her gums. "She is beautiful," Donovan had whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She is absolutely beautiful." "Would you like to hold her?" Grusha had asked, and Donovan had nodded mutely. Grusha had passed the baby to him with careful hands, and Donovan had cradled his daughter against his chest, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility and love that came with her. This tiny person was his, was theirs, was the living proof that love could bridge any divide. "What should we name her?" Grusha had asked. They had discussed many names over the months, but now that the moment was here, Donovan found that only one felt right. "Thora," he said. "After my mother." Grusha had smiled. "Thora, it is a good name, strong." "Thora Xavier," Donovan had said, testing the sound of it. "Welcome to the world, little one." Maud had checked both mother and baby and had declared them healthy, though she had admitted that she was amazed everything had gone as well as it did. "She is a miracle," the healer had said, looking at baby Thora with wonder. "A living miracle." Word of the birth had spread quickly through the village, and the reactions had been as mixed as ever. Some people had sent gifts and congratulations. Others had sent nothing at all. And a few had sent threats, letters warning that a half-breed child had no place in a human community and should be removed before it could spread its taint. Donovan had burned those letters without showing them to Grusha, who was too focused on caring for their newborn daughter to worry about the opinions of bigots. Thora had been a demanding baby, crying frequently and feeding constantly, but she had also been a happy baby, quick to smile and laugh, and both Donovan and Grusha had been completely besotted with her. As Thora had grown, it had become clear that she had inherited traits from both parents. She had Grusha's green skin and small tusks, but Donovan's brown eyes and facial structure. She had been stronger than a human baby from the start, able to lift her head and roll over weeks earlier than normal. But she had also been curious and affectionate in ways that reminded Donovan of himself as a child. The first time they had brought Thora to the village, when she was 3 months old, The reaction had been explosive. Some people had been charmed by the smiling green baby, had cooed over her and asked to hold her. Others had refused to even look at her, had turned away in disgust, or made signs against evil. One woman had actually spat at Grusha's feet and called her child a demon spawn, and Donovan had nearly lost his temper before Father David had intervened. "Enough," the priest had said firmly. "This child is innocent. Whatever your feelings about mixed unions, you will not direct your hatred at an infant. Have you no shame?" The woman had sputtered and retreated, but the damage had been done. Grusha had been quiet on the ride home, holding Thora close to her chest, and Donovan had known she was worrying about what kind of life their daughter would have. "She will always face this, won't she?" Grusha had said that evening as they put Thora to bed. "People will always see her as different, as wrong." "Yes," Donovan had admitted, because he would not lie to his wife. "She will face prejudice and hatred and ignorance, but she will also have us, and we will teach her to be strong and proud of who she is. And maybe, just maybe, she will be the start of something new. Maybe she will be the first of many, and in time people will learn to accept those who are different." "You are an optimist," Grusha had said, but she had been smiling slightly. "I have to be. The alternative is despair, and I refuse to despair when I have you and Thora." They had held each other that night, watching their daughter sleep, and Donovan had made a silent vow that he would spend the rest of his life fighting to make the world a better place for her. As the months had passed, things had slowly begun to change in Millbrook. More people had started to accept Grusha and Thora's presence, partly because they saw how devoted Donovan was to his family, and partly because Thora herself was so charming that it was hard to maintain hatred in the face of her innocent smiles. The baker had taken to saving special treats for when Grusha brought Thora to the village. The miller's wife had knitted tiny clothes for the baby. Even Margaret Thorne, the stern village elder, had softened somewhat, admitting grudgingly that the child seemed healthy and well cared for. But there had still been holdouts, people who would never accept them, and Donovan had learned to identify those people and avoid them when possible. Life was too short and too precious to waste time trying to change minds that were determined to remain closed. Thora's first birthday had been celebrated with a small gathering at the farm, with Father David, Maud, Alice the groundskeeper's daughter, and a few other friendly villagers in attendance. Grusha had baked a cake using a recipe her mother had taught her, and Thora had delighted everyone by shoving her entire face into it and emerging covered in frosting and crumbs. The sound of laughter had filled the farmhouse, and Donovan had looked around at these people who had become their family and had felt grateful beyond words. That night, after everyone had gone home and Thora was asleep, Donovan and Grusha had sat on their porch watching the stars and reflecting on the year that had passed. "A year ago I was pregnant and terrified," Grusha had said. "I did not know if our daughter would survive, if I would survive, if we would be accepted or driven out. And now look at us. We have a beautiful, healthy daughter, a home, friends. It feels like a dream." "It's real," Donovan had assured her, taking her hand. "We made this real together. And we'll keep making it real every day for the rest of our lives." "I love you, Donovan Xavier," Grusha had said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I love you too, Grusha Xavier," he had replied. And they had sat there in comfortable silence until the night grew too cold and they retreated inside to their bed and their sleeping child. The years had continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Thora had grown into a bright, energetic toddler who loved helping in the garden and feeding the chickens and listening to her parents' stories. She had learned to speak both common tongue and Orcish, switching between them effortlessly. and she had shown an early aptitude for numbers and patterns that delighted Donovan. When Thora was 3, Grusha had become pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy had been easier because they knew what to expect. Their second child had been a boy, born in the middle of winter during a snowstorm, and they had named him Doran after Donovan's father. Doran had been quieter than his sister, more contemplative, with his mother's dark hair and his father's facial features and skin that was an even blend of both parents' tones. With 2 children to care for, the farm had become busier, but also fuller of life and love. Thora had adored her baby brother, had insisted on helping care for him, had sung him songs in Orcish that Grusha had taught her. And Doran had looked up at his big sister with absolute devotion, crying whenever she left his sight. The village had continued to grow more accepting, though there were still occasional incidents. When Thora had started attending the village school at age 6, there had been parents who had protested having a half-orc child in class with their children. But Father David, who also served as the schoolteacher, had refused to turn her away, had insisted that all children deserved an education regardless of their heritage. Thora had proven herself to be an excellent student, quick to learn and eager to help others, and most of the other children had accepted her readily enough once they got to know her. There had been one boy, the son of a merchant who had particularly strong anti-orc views, who had bullied Thora relentlessly for her first few months of school. He had called her names, had pulled her hair, had told her she was a monster who did not belong. Thora had come home crying more than once, and Donovan had been ready to go to the boy's parents and demand they control their child. But Grusha had suggested a different approach. She had taught Thora some of the orc techniques for dealing with bullies, which mostly involved standing tall, refusing to show fear, and being willing to fight back if necessary. The next time the boy had tried to push Thora around, she had pushed back, hard enough to send him sprawling in the dirt, and had told him in a voice that echoed her mother's strength that she was not afraid of him and he should leave her alone. The boy had never bothered her again, and word had spread that Thora Xavier was not to be trifled with. Donovan had been proud of his daughter's strength, but he had also worried about her having to grow up fighting for acceptance every day. Grusha had reminded him that strength was not a burden but a gift, and that Thora would need every bit of it to navigate the world they had brought her into. By the time Thora was 10 and Doran was 7, the Xavier family had become an established part of Millbrook community, still somewhat controversial but no longer actively opposed by most residents. Donovan's farm had prospered under his and Grusha's joint management, and they had even hired occasional workers during harvest season, providing employment to some of the village's young men and women who were grateful for the work and the fair wages. Grusha had also begun teaching some of the village women her orc agricultural techniques, which had resulted in better crop yields across the entire region. Her knowledge and expertise had earned her a grudging respect, even from some who still did not approve of her marriage to Donovan. She had been invited to join the village agricultural council, a position she had accepted with quiet pride, and her voice had helped shape policy decisions that benefited everyone. It was during one of these council meetings that news had arrived that would test everything the Xavier family had built. A messenger from the capital had brought word that a new provincial governor had been appointed, a man known for his hardline stance on orc-human relations and his commitment to enforcing what he called racial purity laws. The new governor was conducting a review of all interspecies marriages in the province, and the Xavier family's union was at the top of his list. "They are going to try to annul our marriage," Grusha had said that night after the children were asleep. They are going to try to take you and the children from me. They can try, Donovan had said grimly, but they will not succeed. We have legal documentation, we have a church blessing, we have a decade of marriage and 2 children. No governor is going to undo that. You cannot know that. I know that I will fight with everything I have. I will go all the way to the crown if I have to. You are my wife, Grusha. Nothing and no one is going to change that. 2 weeks later, they had received an official summons to appear before the new governor in Thornhaven. This time they had brought Thora and Doran with them, reasoning that it was better for the children to see their parents fighting for their family than to be left behind wondering what was happening. Governor Edmund Whitmore had been a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and eyes that held no warmth. He had looked at Grusha and the children with unconcealed revulsion, and Donovan had immediately known this was going to be a fight. "Mr. Xavier," Whitmore had said coldly, "I have reviewed your case, and I find it deeply troubling. You have entered into an unnatural union with a creature that is fundamentally incompatible with human society, and you have produced offspring that are neither fully human nor fully orc, but rather a corruption of both bloodlines. With all due respect, Governor, my wife and children are not corruptions of anything. They are my family, and our union is legal under provincial law. Laws that were exploited through technicalities and loopholes. I am here to close those loopholes and restore proper order to our society." Proper order meaning what? Tearing families apart, deporting innocent women and children, punishing people for loving someone different from themselves. It means protecting the purity and integrity of the human race. Orcs and humans are not meant to mix. It is against nature. Grusha had stepped forward at that point, her hand finding Thora's shoulder. "I am standing right here, Governor Whitmore. My children are standing right here. We are not abstract concepts for you to debate. We are people. We have lives, feelings, hopes, dreams. You cannot simply erase us because we make you uncomfortable. I can and I will do whatever is necessary to uphold the law and protect human interests." "Then you are a coward," Grusha had said flatly. "You hide behind laws and rhetoric because you are too afraid to see us as we truly are, too afraid to admit that love and family transcend the boundaries you try to impose." Whitmore's face had flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me that way, you filthy—" "Careful," Donovan had interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You were about to say something you cannot take back, something that would reveal exactly what kind of man you are. Something that would undermine any pretense that this is about law rather than hatred." The governor had clamped his mouth shut, visibly struggling to control himself. Finally, he had said, "I am ordering a full investigation into your marriage and your household. If any evidence is found of fraud, coercion, or impropriety, your union will be annulled and the orc will be deported. Your children will be placed in human custody and raised appropriately." "You will not take our children," Donovan had said, and there was such steel in his voice that even Whitmore had looked momentarily uncertain. "I will burn this entire province to the ground before I let you take my children." "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise. You want to fight, Governor. You will get one. But know that you are fighting a father protecting his family, and there is no force more dangerous than that." The confrontation had ended there, with Whitmore dismissing them curtly and warning them not to leave the province while the investigation was ongoing. Donovan and Grusha had left the governor's office shaken but united, their children pressed close to their sides. The investigation had been thorough and invasive. Officials had come to the farm, had interviewed neighbors, had examined every aspect of their lives looking for any excuse to tear them apart. But they had found nothing because there was nothing to find. The Xavier family was exactly what it appeared to be, a loving household built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The process had taken 3 months, during which Donovan and Grusha had barely slept, both terrified that one morning officials would arrive to take their children. Thora and Doran had been told what was happening, had been frightened but brave, had clung to their parents and each other with determination. Support had come from unexpected sources during those dark months. The village of Millbrook had rallied around the Xavier family, with dozens of residents writing letters to the governor attesting to the family's good character and positive contributions to the community. Father David had traveled to the capital to speak on their behalf, had given impassioned testimony about the strength of their marriage and the love in their household. Even Magistrate Pemberton, who had been so reluctant to approve their marriage years earlier, had submitted a statement affirming that the union was legal and should not be dissolved. In the end, Governor Whitmore had been forced to admit defeat. There was no legal grounds to annul the marriage or remove the children, and attempting to do so would have created a political firestorm that even he was not prepared to face. He had issued a terse statement declaring that, while he personally found the union distasteful, it would be permitted to stand, and the Xavier family was free to continue their lives without further interference. The relief had been overwhelming. Grusha had actually collapsed when she received the news, her legs giving out from the sudden release of tension, and Donovan had caught her and held her while she sobbed into his chest. Thora and Doran had danced around the kitchen celebrating, and that night the entire family had slept in one big pile in the master bedroom, no one wanting to be separated even for a moment. Life had gradually returned to normal after that, though the experience had left its mark on all of them. Thora had become more serious, more aware of the fragility of their happiness. Doran had developed nightmares about men in official uniforms coming to take him away. And Donovan and Grusha had both become more vigilant, more protective, always aware that their family existed in a precarious space between acceptance and rejection. But they had also grown stronger. They had weathered the worst that society could throw at them and had emerged intact, and that knowledge gave them confidence that they could face whatever came next. The years had continued their relentless march forward. Thora had grown into a strong, intelligent young woman, inheriting her mother's green skin and small tusks, but her father's facial structure and expressions. She had excelled in school, had shown particular aptitude for mathematics and engineering, and had dreams of attending university in the capital to study architecture. Donovan had been saving money to make those dreams possible, determined that his daughter would have every opportunity despite the circumstances of her birth. Doran had grown into a thoughtful, gentle boy with a love of plants and animals. He had helped his mother in the garden, had learned the agricultural techniques she taught, and had talked about one day expanding the farm or perhaps starting his own. He had been less concerned with society's opinions than his sister, more content to simply exist in his own space and let the world think what it would. When Thora had turned 18, the same age her parents had been when they met, she had received acceptance to the Royal University in the capital. The letter had come on a spring morning much like the one when Grusha had first arrived at the farm all those years ago, and Thora had screamed with joy and thrown herself into her parents' arms. "I did it," she had said, tears streaming down her green cheeks. "I actually did it." "Of course you did," Grusha had said, holding her daughter close. "You are brilliant and strong and capable of anything you set your mind to. We are so proud of you," Donovan had added, his own eyes misty. "Your mother and I, we are so incredibly proud." The day Donovan and Grusha had taken Thora to the capital to begin her university studies had been bittersweet. They had been proud beyond words, but also heartbroken to see their little girl leaving home, stepping out into a world that would not always be kind to her. Grusha had given Thora a necklace that had belonged to her own mother, a simple leather cord with a polished stone pendant, and had told her to wear it as a reminder that she carried the strength of her ancestors with her always. Donovan had pulled Thora aside privately and had told her, "You are going to face people who see your green skin and your tusks and think they know everything about you. They are going to underestimate you, discriminate against you, try to make you feel small. Do not let them. You are my daughter and you are capable of extraordinary things. Never forget that." "I won't, Papa," Thora had promised, hugging him fiercely. "Thank you for everything, for fighting for us, for never giving up, for showing me what it means to love someone completely." They had left Thora at her university dormitory, and the ride home had been quiet and sad. But it had also been hopeful, because Thora's acceptance to university meant that the world was changing slowly, that doors were opening for people like her that had been closed to previous generations. Doran had continued to help on the farm, growing into a young man of 18 himself within what felt like the blink of an eye. He had been courting a human girl from the village, a blacksmith's daughter named Emma who loved him for exactly who he was, and Donovan and Grusha had welcomed her into their family with open arms. When Doran had announced his intention to marry Emma, Grusha had cried happy tears and Donovan had clasped his son's shoulder with pride. The wedding had taken place in the same small church where Donovan and Grusha had been married 20 years earlier, with Father David, now elderly and frail but still sharp-minded, performing the ceremony. The entire village had attended, a far cry from the small, secretive ceremony that had joined Donovan and Grusha. Times had changed, slowly but surely, and while prejudice had not disappeared, it had diminished enough that a mixed-blood young man could marry a human girl without sparking riots. At the reception, held in the village square, Donovan had stood to give a toast to the newlyweds. 20 years ago, he had said, his arm around Grusha's waist, I made a choice that changed my life forever. I chose love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair. And that choice brought me more joy than I ever imagined possible. Doran, Emma, I wish the same joy for you. May your love be as strong as your mother's and mine, and may it light your way through whatever darkness you may face. The crowd had applauded, and Grusha had kissed Donovan's cheek, and they had danced together under the stars just as they had at their own wedding celebration so many years before. As Donovan held his wife in his arms, moving slowly to the music, he had looked around at the life they had built together. Their daughter was studying at university, breaking barriers and proving that mixed-blood children could achieve anything. Their son was married to a wonderful young woman and planning to start his own family. Their farm was prosperous, and their community, while not perfect, was better and more accepting than it had been. "You ever regret it?" Grusha had asked quietly, following his gaze. "Taking me in that day? Marrying me? Fighting so hard for us?" Donovan had looked down at his wife, at her green skin and her small tusks and her dark eyes that held so much love, and had smiled. "Not for a single second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grusha. You and our children and this life we built together. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the scary parts, the magistrate and the governor and the angry mobs, especially the scary parts, because they proved that our love was worth fighting for, that we were worth fighting for." Grusha had laid her head on his shoulder, and they had continued to dance. Two people from different worlds who had chosen each other and built something beautiful from that choice. Years later, When Donovan was old and gray and his hands were too arthritic to work the farm the way he once had, he would sit on his porch with Grusha beside him and watch their grandchildren play in the yard. Thora had given them 3 grandchildren, all beautiful mixed-blood children who attended the village school without anyone batting an eye. Doran and Emma had added 4 more, human in appearance but raised with the same values of acceptance and love that Donovan and Grusha had instilled in their own children. The world had changed around them, slowly but surely. Interspecies marriages, while still uncommon, were no longer illegal or even particularly shocking. Mixed-blood children were becoming more prevalent, and society was adapting to accommodate them. The old prejudices had not disappeared entirely, but they had faded enough that Donovan's grandchildren would not face the same battles that their parents and grandparents had faced. On Donovan's 70th birthday, the village had thrown him a celebration, honoring him not just as a farmer but as a pioneer who had helped change their community for the better. Father David had been gone for 5 years by then, but his successor, a young priest who had been inspired by the old man's teachings, had given a speech about how Donovan and Grusha's love had taught the village what true faith and courage looked like. Donovan Xavier could have turned away from love because it was difficult, the young priest had said. He could have chosen comfort and safety over connection and growth, but he did not. He chose to see a person in need and help her. He chose to fall in love despite the barriers society placed in his path. He chose to fight for his family when others tried to tear them apart. And because of those choices, all of our lives are richer. Our community is stronger. Our hearts are more open. Thank you, Donovan and Grusha, for showing us the way. The applause had been thunderous, and Donovan had stood with tears in his eyes, holding Grusha's hand just as he had that day in the village square so many decades ago when he had first called her his wife. She had heard those words then for the very first time, and they had changed both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Now, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and friends, Donovan had squeezed Grusha's hand and had said to her quietly, "I would do it all again." "I know," she had said, squeezing back. "So would I." They had lived another decade together after that, watching their grandchildren grow and their community continue to evolve. And when Donovan had finally passed away at the age of 82, surrounded by his family, his last words had been to Grusha. "I love you," he had whispered, his voice barely audible. "My wife, my love, my everything." "I love you too," Grusha had whispered back, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and then stopped. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for fighting for us. Thank you for giving me the most beautiful life." Grusha had lived for 5 more years after Donovan's death, cared for lovingly by her children and grandchildren. She had remained on the farm, tending the gardens and sharing stories about the early days with anyone who would listen. She had been considered a village elder by then, respected and beloved, and young couples of all species combinations had sought her advice on how to navigate the challenges of mixed relationships. When Grusha had finally passed, she had been buried beside Donovan in the village cemetery, their headstones side by side just as they had been side by side in life. The inscription on Grusha's stone, chosen by her children, reads simply, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and pioneer." She showed us that love transcends all boundaries. And in the years that followed, their story had been told and retold, passing into village legend and eventually into historical record. The farmhouse where they had lived and loved and raised their family had been preserved as a historical site, a testament to the power of love to overcome prejudice and fear. Scholars had studied their lives. Writers had romanticized their story, and children had learned about them in school as examples of courage and conviction. But the true legacy of Donovan and Grusha was not in books or monuments or historical markers. It was in the changed hearts of the people who had known them, in the more tolerant society that had grown up in the wake of their choices, in the countless mixed-blood families who lived openly and proudly because two people had dared to love each other despite every obstacle. Their story had started with 3 simple words spoken in a village square. "She's my wife." Words that Grusha had heard for the first time, words that had marked the beginning of everything that came after. Words that had been true in the deepest sense from the moment they were spoken until the moment both of their hearts stopped beating. Words that had changed the world, one life at a time, proving that love was always worth fighting for, always worth celebrating, always worth the risk. And their story, like all great love stories, ended not with death but with legacy, with the knowledge that what they had built together would endure long after they were gone. A testament to the simple truth that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in the world.